Hello, welcome to our webinar on building capacity to invest in rural prosperity, brought to you by CFAIR, the Council on Food, Agricultural, and Resource Economics. My name is Gal Hachman, and I am CFAIR Board Chair and a professor at Rutgers University. It is my pleasure to be moderating today's webinar. It's CFAIR's mission to translate high-level research and knowledge to a diverse audience that includes policymakers, elected officials, and federal administrators. When we demonstrate the value of our profession to these groups, the Council increases public appreciation for research, extension, outreach, and academic programs in agricultural and applied economics. CFAIR has assembled a panel of experts to participate in today's discussion of building the capacity to invest in rural prosperity. Andrew Dumont is a senior community development analyst at the Federal Reserve Board, where he leads the board's work on rural development, affordable housing, and other place-conscious community and economic development topics. Stefan Goetz is the director of the Northeast Regional Center for Rural Development and professor of agricultural and regional economics at the Pennsylvania State University. As director of the Northeast Center, Dr. Goetz provides leadership for rural and community development research and extension activities across 13 states. Karen Diver is the inaugural senior advisor to the University of Minnesota President for Native American Affairs. She's held previous roles with the White House Domestic Policy Council as Special Assistant to President Obama for Native American Affairs. Corianne Kelly is a senior fellow in the Metropolitan Housing and Communities Policy Center at the Urban Institute, where she explores affordable housing and community development policy and practice from large cities to rural towns. Jason Ensminger is the Associate Director of the Northeast Regional Center for Rural Development and is an assistant research professor in the Department of Agricultural Economics, Sociology, and Education at Penn State University. Before we get started, I will hand it over to Andrew Dumont to provide some context for today's discussion. Andrew, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you for that introduction, Gal, and thank you to CFAIR and the RRDCs for sponsoring this event. As Gal mentioned, my name is Andrew Dumont, and I'm a Senior Community Development Analyst at the Federal Reserve Board, where I lead the board's work on rural development. Now, I have the unenviable task of trying to outline some of the key demographic, economic, and climatic forces affecting rural communities today and expected to affect them into the future. And I need to do so in 15 minutes. So since this is a big undertaking, I'm going to go quickly. Now, before I get started, I want to quickly acknowledge that what I will discuss are not the only things affecting rural communities, but represent a selection of trends I thought were important to highlight. I want to apologize in advance for not spending more time on each of these trends. There's a lot more depth there than I'll get into. My contact info is at the end of the presentation, and attendees should feel free to reach out if they want to learn more. Please advance to the next slide. Now, as I noted just now, I will walk you through several key demographic, economic, and climatic trends affecting rural communities in the U.S. Next slide, please. But first, I need to read my disclaimer. The information, analyses, and conclusions set forth are those of the presenter and do not necessarily indicate concurrence by the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, Federal Reserve Banks, or members of their staffs. Next slide. Now, on to the good stuff. This slide summarizes the 3 demographic trends I'll touch on today, being population changes, the effect of changes on the labor force, and the changing racial and ethnic composition of rural areas. Next slide. So we'll start with population changes. On this slide is a chart that shows the rate of population growth in metro and non-metro areas of the past 3 decades. For simplicity's sake, I'll use metro synonymously with urban and non-metro synonymously with rural through my presentation. And I realize that's an oversimplification, but that's what we're going to go with. As you can see from this chart, urban areas have consistently grown faster than rural areas over the past 30 years. And the rightmost pair of bars show that the population of rural areas actually had an absolute decline between 2010 and 2020. Next slide. Now, the map on this slide shows the change in total population for each non-metro county between 2010 and 2020, with shades of blue indicating population growth, while shades of tan or orange indicate population losses. As you can see, while population losses were widespread, some areas of the country did experience population increases over the past decade, most notably in the West and Rocky Mountain regions, as well as select parts of the South, Northeast, and Midwest. Next slide, please. However, even those rural communities that have seen a population increase over the past decade have generally experienced a concurrent decline in their local prime working age population. The map on this slide looks at changes in the prime working age population, defined as those between the ages of 25 and 54 over the past decade. And what you can see in this map is that even many of those areas that saw population growth over the last decade saw a decline in their prime working age population. This shows up quite starkly in the Pacific Northwest, Idaho, Montana, and the Midwest. And this has important implications for the local economies of rural communities. Next slide, please. Now I'll shift to discussing the changing racial and ethnic composition of many rural communities. This set of charts shows that while the rural population in 2019 was predominantly white, non-Hispanic, shown in the left chart, nearly all population growth over the past 3 decades was driven by people of color, primarily Hispanics, shown in the right chart. Next slide, please. Now, this map shows how widespread that increase in the Hispanic population was across rural America in recent decades. The dark blue areas represent rural counties where both the non-Hispanic and Hispanic populations increased between 1990 and 2019. The light blue areas represent rural counties where the population increased over this period solely because of increases in the Hispanic population. The light pink areas represent rural counties where the population declined, but where that decline was partially offset by increases in the Hispanic population. And the dark red areas represent rural counties where both the overall population and the Hispanic population declined over this period. Next slide, please. So I'll now shift to discussing a few economic trends affecting rural communities. And this slide summarizes the long-term economic shifts affecting rural communities I'll touch on today. And those include the rise of the care economy, so-called, the long-term decline in coal mining employment, the automation of the U.S. agricultural industry, the globalization and automation of manufacturing, and finally, the widespread shift to the so-called knowledge-based economy. Next slide, please. So first, I'll touch on the rise of the so-called care economy. Now, not surprisingly, given the aging of the rural population, the healthcare and social assistance sector, or industry rather, was the most significant driver of employment growth in non-metro areas between 2001 and 2020. And that's represented by the orange line on this chart, while all other private non-farm employment, excluding healthcare and social assistance, is represented by the blue line. Now, employment in the healthcare and social assistance industry grew by nearly 350,000 over that approximately 20-year time period. It represents an 18% increase and the largest absolute increase of any industry. Next slide, please. Next, I'll touch on the decline in coal mining employment. On this slide is a chart that shows the change in employment in the oil and gas industry, represented by the orange line, in the mining industry, not including oil and gas extraction, which is the gray line, and in all other private industries, being the blue line. Now, this chart shows that between 2007 and 2017, oil and gas extraction experienced a boom in employment. However, much of the increase in employment seen in that industry has since dissipated as oil prices plummeted in the latter part of the decade. Now, over this same period, coal and other forms of mining saw a 20% decline in employment, a trend that shows no signs of reversing. Now, these mining industry employment gains and losses have not been evenly distributed across the country, but have been highly concentrated in certain regions. For example, nearly 3/4 of coal mining employment losses have been concentrated in just 3 states, West Virginia, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania. And 90% of oil and gas extraction employment gains have been in just 6 states, including Colorado, Kansas, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Pennsylvania, and Texas. Next slide, please. Now, another factor affecting the rural economy is the ongoing automation of the agricultural sector. Now, this chart shows that agricultural output, shown here by the blue line, remained relatively stable for much of the period from around 1970 through 2020, with a couple periods of increased output. Now, at the same time, agricultural employment, shown here by the orange line, has declined by 35% over that period, representing a decline of nearly 2.4 million jobs. Next slide, please. The next trend I'll highlight is changes in the manufacturing industry. The graph on this slide shows that between 2000 and 2020, the U.S.'s share of global manufacturing, shown here by the blue line, declined from 24% to 16%, while China's share of global manufacturing, shown here as the red line, went from 10% to 31%. It's important to note that even over this period, U.S. manufacturing output increased by around 38%, while manufacturing employment declined by nearly 20%. Again, this decline has not been even across all types of manufacturing. For example, employment in food and beverage manufacturing is up by 8% over that period, while employment in textile and apparel manufacturing is down by 2/3. And since different manufacturing is distributed across different communities, this has important geographic implications. Next slide, please. Now, this chart shows that rural areas were far more exposed to the overall declines in manufacturing employment that I just described than urban areas were. The 3 sets of bars on the left represent the share of income in metro and non-metro areas derived from the manufacturing industry, while the 3 sets of bars on the right are the share of employment. Now, from the chart, we can see that both urban and rural areas experienced a decline from 2001 to 2010 in the share of income and employment from manufacturing. And from 2010 to 2019, this share rebounded in rural areas, while urban areas did not see that share rebound. Again, importantly, it's important to note that urban manufacturing income and employment did increase over this latter decade. It just increased to a lesser degree than the increase that took place in other industries, while the manufacturing rebound in rural areas was stronger than what occurred in other industries. Now, while this manufacturing story may sound positive for rural areas, I believe it symbolizes rural areas not making as much of a shift to the knowledge-based economy than urban areas did. Which brings me to the last economic trend I'll highlight beginning on the next slide, which is the rise of the knowledge-based economy. These 3 charts show the share of occupations that are in low skill, middle skill, and high skill jobs by population density, and how that changed between 1980, 2000, and 2015. Now, there's a lot going on in this chart, so in the interest of time, I'm just going to summarize high-level takeaways rather than walking through it in detail. Now, the left chart shows that less dense areas have a much higher share of jobs in low-skill occupations than more dense areas, and that this relationship remained consistent between 1980 and 2015. The middle chart shows that mid-skill occupations used to be more prevalent in more dense areas, but are now rare across all community densities, shown by the downward shift from the blue line to the green line. The right chart shows that more dense areas have a much higher share of jobs in high-skill occupations, and that this advantage became much more pronounced between 1980 and 2015. There are several reasons that we see these outcomes for rural economies as the nation shifted towards a knowledge-based economy. First, the knowledge-based economy has historically favored agglomeration, which has in the past structurally disadvantaged more rural places. Second, rural areas have lower levels of educational attainment, which we know is important to fostering a knowledge-based economy. And lastly, rural areas have less access to affordable high-speed internet, particularly low-income communities and communities of color. Next slide, please. I'll now briefly walk you through key climatic trends affecting rural communities. And again, this slide summarizes those key climatic trends that are and are expected to continue affecting rural communities, including projected increases in average annual temperatures, changes in precipitation levels and the intensity of precipitation events, increasing wildfire risks, increasing flood risks, particularly in the south and along the East Coast, and the geographically concentrated effects of potential climate change mitigation strategies. Next slide, please. First, annual average temperatures. Annual average temperatures in the US have increased 1.2 degrees Fahrenheit over the past few decades and are projected to increase by another 2 degrees Fahrenheit by mid-century and by between 3 degrees Fahrenheit and 12 degrees Fahrenheit by 2099, depending on what actions the global community may or may not take. Importantly, the projected increases between now and mid-century are virtually assured, regardless of any actions we may take to limit future warming. While increasing temperatures are expected to disproportionately affect urban areas due to their heat island effects, they are also likely to significantly affect certain workers and industry in rural areas, such as those in agriculture and tourism. Next slide, please. Next, precipitation levels and intensity. Since the beginning of the 20th century, annual precipitation has increased across most of the northern and eastern US and decreased across much of the southern and western US. These trends are projected to continue over the next century. Alongside these overall precipitation levels, heavy precipitation events, which is defined as precipitation events, rainfall or snowfall, above the 99th percentile of daily values, are expected to continue to occur more frequently and with greater intensity. Research has yet to establish a causal relationship between changes in precipitation and the incidence of extreme events, such as riverine flooding, but that could be a risk. Across much of the US, surface soil moisture is projected to decrease as the climate warms, driven by increased evaporation due to warmer temperatures. This is likely to mean future droughts will be stronger and last longer. Next slide, please. Now, as noted on the previous slide, some areas of the country are at increasing drought risk, particularly the Southwest, as we've seen in recent years. Now, this map shows the change in the standardized precipitation evapotranspiration index, or SPEI, which measures the combination of water supply via precipitation and atmospheric water demand via evapotranspiration. Now, this is a worrying trend with significant implications, being the significant decrease in SPEI in the Southwest in particular. especially given that the darkest part of this map is California, which produced nearly 14% of American agriculture in 2020, including, importantly, 43% of vegetables and melons and 73% of fruits and nuts. Next slide, please. Another issue related to the increase in drought conditions across many rural communities is a resulting increase in wildfire incidence and intensity. Importantly, communities of color are much more vulnerable to wildfires than communities that are predominantly white, non-Hispanic. And this is especially true of people who identify as Native American, Black, or Hispanic, as shown in these charts, where increasing shares of the population of those groups is to the right of the chart, and increasing wildfire vulnerability is higher. Next slide, please. Now, the map on this slide shows the current estimated geographical distribution of flood risk across the continental US. As you can see, the Northwest, Northeast, Louisiana coast, and Appalachia have the largest estimated flood risk as a proportion of the total value of their real estate. These communities are at greatest the communities that are at greatest risk are disproportionately poorer with a proportionately larger white population. Next slide, please. However, the communities that will face the greatest increase in their flood risk over the next 30 years, which is shown by the map on this slide, have disproportionately large Black populations, including virtually all communities along the Gulf and East Coasts. Next slide, please. Lastly, efforts to mitigate the effects of climate change will likely have disproportionate effects on certain communities. Take, for example, the transition to the clean energy economy. That transition reduces demand for oil, natural gas, and coal, which it's expected to, therefore affect income and employment in those industries. The effects will be highly concentrated in just a handful of states, as shown on this map. Next slide, please. I know that was a lot, so thanks for sticking with me. Now I'm happy to pass it back to Gal to introduce the next panel.
Thank you very much, Andrew, for this very comprehensive overview. In our next segment, we invite our panelists to participate in a Q&A that will be moderated by Stefan Gotet. Before I hand it over to Stefan, I just want to remind you, the audience, to place your questions and forward it to the organizers so we can share it with the panelists and respond to any questions or queries you might have. With that, Stefan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Gal, and thank you, Andrew, for that excellent whirlwind tour of problems facing rural communities. I think you really did a great job summarizing those. So, as noted, we've assembled a panel of expert practitioners to ask them to provide some insights from their perspectives on how communities that they work with may react to these trends, maybe benefit from them for their well-being, and address them in the future. So if I may start with you, Karen, please, in the context of the communities you work with, what does rural well-being even look like, and what are the unique opportunities available in those communities that our audience should know about, excuse me.
Well, thank you for having me. I am coming to you today from my homelands on the Fond du Lac Reservation. It's located in northern Minnesota. It is one of 11 tribal communities here in Minnesota, although I've worked both nationally and locally as a tribal leader, an elected tribal leader, as well as policymaker. So a lot of my comments focus on the intersection between rural and tribal communities. And first of all, while we have many assets, one of the deficits we consistently face is a lack of data. You know, whenever anything is broken down, especially by race, and or political status, you'll often see just huge gaps in understanding because we're not statistically significant enough to show up, even though we have huge opportunity to have impact. Across the country, there are 270 plus tribes, many of them rural, and for many of them, the largest, if not among the largest, rural employers. Many of them have hospitality operations, but what they do with their hospitality funding, it doesn't fund shareholders or a few owners. It funds the commonwealth of the tribe, and they invest that back into government and services. So the multiplier that tribes have in exerting their sovereignty and their own self-determination really matters. I'll use Minnesota as an example. Collectively, the 11 tribes are the 14th largest employer in the state. So for many of us, my tribe is the second largest employer in St. Louis County. You might be thinking to yourself, well, you know, what does that matter? Well, St. Louis County is larger than many of the East Coast states. So it's a large swath of real estate. We draw from 57 different zip codes for our employment base. So it's not just all tribal members who are employed, it's lifting up communities. When I talk about that swath of government services that tribes invest in through their economic development activities, we're talking doctors, teachers, public works employees, natural resource managers, and scientists. So, you know, the job classifications aren't, you know, as characterized in the report before as just the care economy. These are professions, you know, as well as mid-level and entry-level jobs that are lifting up the rural economy. When I talk about assets, when I talked about sovereignty and self-determination, decision-making is very local for tribes and regulated by their own authority as governments. Of course, the difficulty then is having tribal governments relate to the jurisdictions around us. Often there's kind of a divestment of responsibility by other jurisdictions to tribal citizens. They say, let the tribe take care of it, even though we are citizens of townships, counties, in some cases, definitely of states, but sometimes of cities as well. So that lack of interjurisdictional kind of cooperation and landscape scale planning is an issue. As we look at climate change issues, you know, that's a real existential threat to tribes in terms of our lifeways. So tribes are very much exerting stewardship activities, regulatory authority and control, and advocacy over what is happening in the regions where they have these rights to these lifeways, treaty rights, the rights to hunt, fish, and gather in customary ways that were guaranteed to them. So that's a challenge interjurisdictionally where, you know, in northern Minnesota, we're trying to hang on to manufacturing and extractive industries, and that's becoming, it was a former life way that is becoming less popular as we look at preserving the water quality of the region and what extractive industries do to that. So, you know, that balance between economic development and preservation of landscape as well as resiliency activities ends up being a challenge in many tribal communities where people see tribes exerting stewardship as a problem in terms of inhibiting what their economic development options are. But yet they're also a part of the solution. Right now in the Biden administration, equity for tribal communities is high on the list of priorities. Equity for everyone, but also in particularly tribal communities. They have to have that equity agenda. So we see huge investments in broadband deployment into these rural communities so that tribes can participate in that knowledge economy and be connected and access education and for entrepreneurs. Tribes are also using that money through USDA and other entities to look at food security issues and supply chain issues because they saw themselves as particularly vulnerable during the pandemic. Those are going to have regional wide implications in terms of how we look at access to food as other parts of the country end up being stressed in terms of climate change. tribes also have access to other types of infrastructure in terms of their own employment and training kind of pathways with tribal colleges and connections with state institutions. So there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of opportunity because of equity. There's a lot of opportunity because tribes are fairly young population-wise, and their people want to stay home in their tribal communities. Tribes are taking the leadership in terms of evolving and trying to make their economies resilient and not just rely on hospitality. So you're seeing them get into other ventures that are less prone to spikes in the economy. They're looking at climate resiliency and caretaking of their homelands, and all of this they do not from a philosophy of wealth generation or access to market. They do it because our values are different. It's really about community caretaking and protecting each other. And so when you bring that value-based difference to decision-making, whether it's economic, natural resources, community development, it ends up giving a different set of answers for tribal communities than some of the jurisdictions around us. Tribes are just kind of waiting to have those conversations interjurisdictionally, though.
Great, thank you for that, Karen. Before I move on, I just want to point out the question that Victoria has posted. Andrew, I don't know if you want to answer that in writing or address it afterwards as part of the panel. But thanks again, Karen. My next question will go to Corianne. Please, what assets do rural communities have that they can use to convert these emerging trends that were outlined by Andrew into rural prosperity and well-being from your perspective?
Yeah, thanks so much. If we could start my slides, that would be great. I think that what I have to talk about quickly dovetails really nicely from Andrew's kind of overview of some trends and some challenges facing rural places and people, as well as Karen's discussion about data challenges and being able to identify assets that that tribal leaders and members and other individuals and organizations across rural America can really leverage to make change, not just to identify problems. So what I wanted to highlight today was some work we've done to try and highlight the tremendous diversity of rural people and places using an asset-based framework to really help funders and practitioners take action and leverage real assets in rural places. Excuse me. We searched over 200 national databases, to your point, Karen, trying to look for both kind of standard measures of rural assets as well as more unique ones using the community capitals framework. Next slide. For those of you who may not be familiar with the Community Capitals Framework, it was developed by rural sociologists and includes 7 types of community capitals or categories of assets that are critical for community well-being and thriving. I'm going to run through these 7 categories quickly. I certainly won't do them justice, but hopefully they will come across as a diverse group. So first we have built capital, which really focuses on infrastructure, which we measured according to housing, transportation, emergency response, and communications systems. Human capital focuses on a lot of what Karen was talking about in terms of supporting an educated, healthy, and skilled labor force and thus economy. Financial capital looks at individual and community wealth, as well as access to financial institutions and resources. Cultural capital includes the diversity of people who live in a region, the languages they speak, and the cultural institutions that they support. Natural capital takes into account environmental amenities and resources that support economic activity, such as some of the activities Andrew discussed, as well as health and well-being. Political capital measures influence and power over public priorities and policies. And then finally, social capital is about the interconnectedness of communities and how relationships and trust are leveraged for community thriving. So for each of these 7 capitals, we created 4 to 12 measures and jointly analyzed those to create 7 peer groups of rural census tracts that have similar assets within each group on average, but are distinct from one another. And what you're seeing here is what these 7 groups are and how they fall geographically. And I'm just going to quickly highlight a couple of the more unique measures that we created and show how their values on average different across these peer groups. So next slide, please. And I'll go through these very quickly. So as I mentioned, human capital focuses on assets related to health, employment, and education. So in addition to more common measures that we typically think of and were included in our work, such as labor force participation, educational attainment, access to health care, access to health insurance, we also included these 2 more unique measures. Child care centers and nursing homes can support employment by providing quality care for children and elders in the community so that working age caregivers can work outside of the home. And I think we would all agree that they're also important in supporting the well-being and health of our children and elders. And here we see that we see 2 groups with opposite strengths in access to health care versus nursing home capacity. And we also see that the Centers for Wealth and Health, that yellow bar, perform well on average across both measures. Next slide, please. In terms of natural capitals, high quality environmental conditions and low levels of pollution often set apart rural communities from urban ones. And here we see that while air quality is good overall across our peer groups, there are still groups that are experiencing cleaner air on average than others. Next slide, please. And finally, social capital is one of the hardest types of assets to measure quantitatively, particularly at a national scale. So what we highlighted in this instance were public libraries as community institutions that serve as important gathering places and social hubs for rural places, in addition, of course, to the other services that they commonly provide, from books, naturally, to internet access to voter registration. Next slide. If you would like to see all of the different assets that we quantified and explore the peer groups, take a look at finding your census tract or the census tracts of the areas you serve, we would certainly welcome you to visit our website. And Karen, I will note that when you select the census tract, you can see tribal land coverage, the % of tribal land coverage on the census tracts as well. So we did try and include that as a key characteristic worth looking at. Thank you very much.
Hey, thank you very much, Corianne. In the interest of time, rather than asking the other 2 panelists to respond also, I'll pass it over to Jason. But please also know that any resources that you're requesting in the Q&A, we will make them available to you through the link that Corianne just shared. But thank you again. Okay, Jason, can you tell us, please, what you learned from the recent RRDC's work on the state of rural capacity to use the types of assets that have been discussed?
Yeah, you know, Stefan, I'm really struck in listening to Andrew highlight the trends and Karen speak about well-being from the lens and the perspective of tribal communities, and then seeing Corianne's work on assets, just how much our recent work on, you know, what rural development stakeholders are seeing in their communities as top priorities and capacity needs are bringing all of these things together, right? Because capacity is really about how we can leverage the assets that Corianne talks about to address the trends that Andrew talked about, but in the contexts like the one that Karen gave. And so for me, capacity in our listening sessions, what really came out is that capacity is both contextual and therefore not monolithic, and yet there are a lot of really core issues and problems and challenges that rural communities are facing in terms of how to leverage the assets they have to address their contexts. One of the things that Andrew brought up, for example, is broadband. And in the listening sessions, broadband and being able to invest in broadband and digital skills that go with it, right? That human capital asset as well as the physical asset was just ubiquitous across any topic we talked about, whether it was health, whether it was education, whether it was entrepreneurship and remote work and workforce development. It was this underlying massive challenge. And yet, that physical infrastructure piece and those public services, despite being this top priority, were the area where rural communities said they had the lowest capacity to actually engage in investment and building out the kinds of programs and the kinds of infrastructure that was needed. And that trend was something we saw across the listening sessions, where rural community stakeholders engaged in developing their communities, identified priorities, and then said that for their top priorities, their capacities were the lowest. They have lots of capacity to deal with agriculture and food systems and health systems, but these other kinds of things like physical infrastructure, like climate change, were challenges for them. And so I start to think about, okay, if we're thinking of capacity, we can't just talk about technical assistance or this immediate ability to access funding, but really how we build out these long-term structures that, as Karen brought up, can bring resilience in those contexts. And so I think that's going to be really our next step for the RRDC listening sessions, is bringing out how those long-term capacity investments can be made and where they need to be made, right? What do rural communities need to have for that longer-term ability to leverage those assets?
Great, thank you very much, Jason. And I would just like to remind the audience that if you do have questions or comments on any of the discussion above, there is the chat box available that I think you all have access to. At least in mine, it's in the lower right-hand corner. I did want to ask the panel members to see if they had any urgent responses, insights to the comments made by any of the other speakers on sort of the what does rural well-being look like, what are some of the assets out there, and then also any reactions to what Jason just laid out for us. So Karen, I might start with you because you were first, and if not, that's perfectly fine.
I know we're trying to focus on assets, but sometimes I'm a glass half empty kind of girl. One of the challenges that, we're seeing up here in northern Minnesota is workforce housing. People are finding out that they can live rural. We're actually, it's one of the top outdoor areas. So and it's supposed to be a climate resilient area, they say. And so people are looking at this as a new homelands of choice. But with staffing challenges, we don't have anywhere to put anyone that's affordable. And people are coming in, and are able to work remotely and driving prices up. Which makes development costs high, but yet overall wages aren't rising enough to keep pace. So, they're just such complex issues. It's just not as easy as saying, we need broadband and then people can telework from there. There's nowhere for them to telework from. And aging infrastructure. I mean, we haven't invested in rural. It doesn't necessarily have the capacity to grow. We've got failing, community water systems, septic systems. We have plenty of healthcare for a lot of us because that was a growing industry and they invested in themselves. The divide falls apart when it required public investment. And you can't always rely on the corporations. They're not deploying broadband because it's not worth it to them. We need government investment. And so somehow we need to incent industry to the table and or decide what should be a public function. I got in a little bit of trouble during the Obama administration, I'll admit it, because I thought one of the answers to broadband deployment was the rural electric cooperatives. They have the rights of way already and they know how to run a utility. And I'm like, why not give them the money and have them start deploying broadband or rural America? They already know how to do it and they have a lot of the infrastructure in place. And I got shut down pretty hard, saying I didn't understand the political clout of the rural electric cooperatives. And, I'll tell you, no, I didn't understand that. But it seemed like a logical piece of infrastructure we already had in place, but yet there are political and policy barriers. And somehow we need to start thinking about those in a really different way in terms of public good.
Thank you for that. Yes, clearly it's a whole set of issues, not just one, that's lacking. We do have a question that came in from in the chat box, and that is for any of you. When speaking of capacity, what would you say limits rural communities' capacities? And related to that, how do you create more resilient capacities? Would anybody care to take a stab at that?
One of the things that comes to my mind that came up over and over and over again in our listening sessions is maybe something that we don't always think about as a capacity, but it's the ability to retain and attract youth, to have younger generations in rural communities. And I bring that up for an example of, one of the things that has come out is if we don't have youth in these communities that remain there, that reside there, who's going to take over running the local government that then has responsibility for making these decisions and governing the community and providing leadership to the community as we face that demographic trend that Andrew highlighted. And so one of the constraints that I think about in terms of rural communities is it's not capacity is not just about the immediate capacity now, but it's that longer range capacity that's needed to allow communities to respond to changing trends, to be innovative, to form new partnerships, and to sort of think outside of the box about how to leverage the assets that they do have. And so thinking of capacity, in that human sense also, I think is really important. It's not just financial, it's not just physical assets, but it's also these longer range environmental and human elements. And Corianne, I don't know if that resonates with any of the work you've done, or Karen with yours, but.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, so we have two other questions come in and from two different speakers, and I'll just take the liberty of combining them. But it's this question of basically accessing grants.gov, maybe a black hole, but it's clearly it can be an overwhelming undertaking. And I guess this question is to you, Corianne, if I may, but the capacity of rural or tribal communities, because you're dealing with capitals, to respond to development opportunities and challenges seems to be critical. And then, so this ability to respond, right, which is not captured in the ones that you've laid out explicitly, but either of you or any one of you, do you have thoughts on that? It's basically the ability to get the resources to develop in capacity, right? How do you do that?
So we have some tangentially related measures that you can find within our typology and dashboard that we thought could be helpful in indicating where there might be some capacity resources available. So if you select the census tract, you'll see, for example, whether or not there's a local United Way affiliate that whose service area covers that census tract. We also looked at chambers of commerce, and so you'll see if there's a chamber of commerce, sometimes multiple chambers of commerce, even at the census tract level, again, as another institution that might have some ability to help pursue federal funding. Also, regional government networks, we tell you if the census tract falls within the service area of one of the existing regional commissions, like the Appalachian Regional Commission, Delta, and I think Northern Border Commission. So we tried to indicate some places where folks might be able to go to get some assistance in tapping into resources. We do actually have a measure of federal, recent federal resources as well, which is a measure of, maybe financial resources and capital coming in, but it's also a measure of whether there are organizations and institutions within that, usually within the county as a whole, that have capacity to go after federal funding. So you can see, whether a census tract has been receiving a lot of investments or not, normalized, I think, per thousand population, and get a sense of whether there's somebody there who's navigated grants.gov successfully enough to get funding from the federal government.
Great, thank you for that. Any other quick reactions, Karen or Jason? And again, if not, it's fine.
Oh, Karen,
I'll just say quickly, tribes are not. Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, you can hear me?
No,
okay, yes. I'm not in control of mute. Tribes aren't monolithic, and so you really do have a range of where high capacity tribes continue to be able to leverage new opportunities that are coming out. Smaller, under-resourced tribes tend to do it at a much slower pace. So it's kind of hit and miss. One of the things that is in common is, by and large, almost all of them get left out of any kind of interjurisdictional regional development agencies. And that's really a key gap, I think, going forward in terms of developing, strategy by region. And really assessing what those strengths are you have to work from, and what kind of mitigation you need for your weaknesses.
Great. Thank you.
And that just makes me, both of those comments make me think of sort of one word in the institutional sense, which is having a convener, right? This just came up in a conversation we had with an advisory committee on this series of events that we're doing with CFAIR on this issue. And that really stuck with me, right? Is when communities have a convener that can bring the different players to the table, but we haven't done a good job of investing in building conveners in a lot of places, so that there is that institutional framework to bring players to the table to build out those capacities.
I thank you all. I don't know if we can loop Andrew back in, but if not, I'm sure we'll find another way of answering these questions. But there was a question to Andrew whether he quickly has a thought on what you believe to be most harmful to communities of color of the three trends that you've identified.
Sure, yeah. I just typed up a response, but happy to talk about it here as well. So I think certainly rural communities of color are very disproportionately exposed to the projected negative effects of climate change. So whether that is increased flooding or hurricanes along the Gulf Coast and East Coast, whether that's wildfire in the West, sort of across the board, regardless of what the challenge is, it seems that communities of color are disproportionately exposed to that. So I think over the longer term, that's a very significant issue for rural communities of color. In the nearer term, I think the sort of changing composition of employment and the hollowing out of middle skill occupations, I think largely through automation, whether it's manufacturing, agriculture, sort of across the board, that hollowing out of mid-skill occupations presents a very significant economic challenge in the near term.
Okay. Great, thank you, Andrew. Gal, we're coming up on the hour. I want to make sure you have enough time to close, and we do have a few more interesting questions, but if, as I said, we might find other ways of answering it. And I do want to give you time because you have some important more details, I think.
No, first of all, thank you, Stefan, and thank you, the panel. It's interesting to learn more about rural communities and understand them. This was a very engaging and informative discussion, and so really thank you for that. And next slide. We want to let the audience know that immediately following this, you'll be sent a follow-up survey. Your feedback is really important to us for better understanding trends and challenges faced by rural communities. And your responses will guide us in future program and events. It really takes about a minute. So we will really appreciate if you can just answer those few questions in the poll. Next slide, please. Before we wrap up, we encourage those that enjoyed this webinar to sign up for our newsletter, where you will get more information on similar events online at cfair.org. A recording of this webinar will also be made available on our website and YouTube in the coming days, and you will get an email. Anyone that registered will get an email notifying her or him once the webinar becomes online. You can also follow us on podcast. We currently have an interview or very nice discussion with the USDA Economist Group, and we recommend you go to Apple or rss.com and just visit us. If you have any questions, we encourage you to follow up. Email us at information@cfair.org. Next slide, please. Very importantly, I want to thank our partners. Without them, none of this will be possible. This and other CFAIR programming won't be possible without the continuing support of the Agricultural and Applied Economic Association, AAEA, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, National Statistical Service, NASS, as well as the Department's Economics Research Service, ERS. Thank you. Next slide. A big thank you to our panelists, where I include also Andrew in it. This was a very interesting and stimulating and educating session. Lastly, we want to thank you, the audience. We're passionate about this topic, and we think you are too, but it's not a small thing to give up an hour of time to spend it with us. We hope you enjoyed this event as much as we enjoyed hosting it, and we hope to see you in future events. Thank you so much and have a great day.